So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Access and Access program, Women in Leadership. Oh, well, there it is again. Women in Leadership, Building Bridges Across Cultures and Generations. So we do appreciate your joining us today. I am Dr. Pierre Rogers. I'm the director of the Axelson Center. So I'll give a brief background about our center and about our event today. I'll share some logistics about the panel discussion, and then I'll pass it over to our panelists to introduce themselves. So the Axelson Center offers nonprofit management education and professional development training. We're part of the School of Business and Nonprofit Management at North Park University here in Chicago, where you can earn a certificate or a degree in nonprofit management, in business, and several other majors. Axelson Center programs include workshops, webinars, awards for nonprofit managerial excellence, custom training, an annual conference, and a boot camp for new nonprofit CEOs or executive directors. Our Axelson Access programs are a little different from our usual workshops or webinars in that we take up more strategic issues and we seek to facilitate conversations that help us all to think differently about leadership and everything that it entails. Earlier this year, we had conversations on Black philanthropy matters and the state of nonprofits in 2021. But today we're talking about women in leadership. We have a wide range of folks in our audience today, from some of North Park's undergrad students to senior level nonprofit leaders, both locally and from different parts of the country. The topic of leadership is being explored in so many new ways recently. And today we'll examine leadership through a lens of race, gender, across generations, and even organizational subsectors. Our panelists today bring a wide variety and depth of experience and expertise on the joys and the complexities of leadership. And I am excited to facilitate this conversation. Three of our panelists are nonprofit leaders. And our fourth, our guest, Melissa Abad, is a researcher who will offer some historic context for the topic after the nonprofit leaders have introduced themselves and started the conversation. But before we get started, let me just share a couple of logistics. So we have two discussion areas. The chat, which folks are more used to, is there for you to communicate comments and resources to each other. The Q&A function allows you to present questions to the panelists and then vote to prioritize the questions that are presented. So please, as you have questions for the panelists, do put them in the Q&A, as the panel will engage the questions there later in the event, or it could be that we call them up during the conversation. In addition, keep in mind that we're recording this session and it will be available to attendees at your request. So now, if each of the panelists could introduce themselves, and then we'll dive into our conversation, and then Melissa will follow. So Irene, would you like to get us started? And then you can pass it off to each other.
Of course. Thank you, Pierre. Hello, everyone. My name is Irene Jison, the Executive Director of Hano Family Alliance, and I will be celebrating my 20th work anniversary with Hano next year. And it's been over 5 years since I have been serving as the executive director of the organization. I was born in South Korea, and my family immigrated to the US when I was 15 years old. After getting my bachelor's degree in international studies and master's degree in social work, it was pretty clear to me that I wanted to work with refugee and immigrants. And that's how I moved my way to Chicago, and I began my journey with the organization, Hano Family Alliance. And Hano is a 34-year-old nonprofit social service organization whose mission is to provide comprehensive community-based services for Korean older adults and immigrant families. We have three core service branch areas, which is healthy aging, family wellness, and community engagement. We're right next to North Park University campus, so if anyone happens to be in the area, stop by and say hi. And I'm very honored to be part of this program today and being with three other wonderful panel speakers. Thank you.
Thanks. Linda, you want? Yeah.
Good afternoon. Buenas tardes, everyone. My name is Linda Tortolero. I'm the president and CEO of Mujeres Latinas en Acción. We're the longest standing Latina organization in the country. I'm a Chicago native, first generation born here in Chicago in the United States. My family is from Mexico and a Southsider. I have been in this role for a little over 4 years, but I first worked at Mujeres Latinas en Acción after leaving private law. One of the reasons why I found this to be a great fit for me is that I was attracted to law because it was a way for me to become a better advocate for our community. And Mujeres does a lot of advocacy work and community mobilization. So in addition to gender-based violence services, as well as entrepreneurship, education, and leadership development, we actively engage in various institutional advocacy and other larger advocacy initiatives. Thanks so much for inviting me to the panel.
And I guess that leaves me last. Brittany Robbins, I'm the founder and CEO of the Gray Matter Experience. It's a 5-year-old nonprofit based here in Chicago that works with Black high school students and young adults to expose them to entrepreneurship, help them to create businesses that impact their community, and just get them more acclimated with the entrepreneurial ecosystem. This year we celebrate our 5th year anniversary, and shameless plug, we have our anniversary celebration a week from today. So I'll drop the link in the chat in case any of you would like to join us. In addition to my role at the Gray Matter Experience, I am also the manager of partnerships and community at Cleveland Avenue, which is a local Black venture capital firm. They are working on an initiative to support Black, brown, and women entrepreneurs across the city of Chicago and Chicagoland area to help them grow their companies. And thirdly, this spring, I will be an adjunct professor at Loyola teaching a social impact course on strategy and leadership. So this conversation is very timely, and I'm grateful to be here and in community with all of the other panelists and all of the attendees. So thank you for having me.
Great, thanks, Brittany. So Melissa, why don't you just do a quick intro and then I'll start with the questions with the panelists.
Sure, thanks, Pierre. My name is Melissa Abad. I'm a sociologist here at the Stanford VMware Women's Leadership Innovation Lab, where I get paid to have fun, and more specifically, my research focuses on the career trajectories of women of color in both the nonprofit and for-profit sector. I'm also a Chicago native. I was studying immigrant serving nonprofits in the Midwest before I moved out to California, and now I study tech. But what I'm learning so far is that there's not many differences between the industries, and more importantly, that the experiences and wisdom women of color bring to organizations needs to be highlighted and valued. So it's really a pleasure to be in the company of such esteemed community advocates. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So why don't we get started with our questions? So the first one has to do with this issue. How did you come to realize that you were a leader? Brittany, I'll put you on the spot.
Lovely. I think I kind of always knew from a young age. I was always looked at and seen as a role model for younger girls, and found myself sort of always in sort of unofficial leadership roles. It really wasn't until I started my career path that I started realizing that I was one of the folks that always sort of went against the grain and wasn't going with the crowd, and that people were gravitating to that. And so through starting my company and starting to hear feedback from folks on, hey, you inspire me, or, you know, we're watching you, or that there was just more interest in sort of my development as a leader, helped me to sort of better realize that, again, people are watching and that they're looking to me to be a leader and sort of open some of these doors. And so I think it's something that has always sort of been there and I've always known, but has gradually increased as my platform has increased over the years.
Linda?
I would say that it probably happened when I realized I had a voice, that people wanted to hear from me, people wanted to learn what I had to say, and that folks were looking to me to represent what was going on in my community. So I think really early on in my career in not-for-profits, when I was working in the Chicago Empowerment Zone projects in Pilsen Little Village, having platform with the city of Chicago, having regular meetings, and people wanted to know what was of interest from our community. I think that's when it really dawned on me that people are looking to me to lead. And a little scary being 22 at the time, but I think it's something that I took on with a lot of stride and felt very privileged to be in that position.
Well, for me, I'm going to start out by saying the role of a mentor is extremely important when you shape your leadership model and your leadership in a journey. My first mentor was actually a middle-aged Korean male who was the former executive director. Very autocratic leadership style, but I thought a good leader is a hardworking, never turning down work, getting things done on time, and sacrificing always. So I thought these were the moments when I realized I was a great leader. But when I became the deputy executive director and I got to work more closely with the executive director on a very different management level, I did realize that having to deal with a negative leadership experience actually motivated me to step out of my own comfort zone and truly accept myself as a leader. So when I became the executive director, that's when I actually found myself as a true leader. And at that time, I was just determined to make change. I wanted everybody to see what the true leadership was all about. And I have witnessed firsthand how different leadership style can actually bring tremendous impact on an organization such as mine. So.
Great, thank you. So let me add a little bit of another angle to that. So Brittany, I think you said when you were growing up, you kind of always knew that you were a leader. People looked to you in that way. And I think Linda, you kind of got pulled into it in that way. And Irene, it sounds like you, in an organizational setting, kind of looked to a mentor and began to grow and realize leadership potential in yourself in that way. So I had a quite different experience and kind of being exposed to the notion that leadership had to look a certain way. Leadership had to be embodied in a big personality, that people had to be extroverts, that people had to be big, right? And I was an introvert. And so I never thought of myself as a leader because I didn't fit what kind of this image was that was in my head and that is often out there in public to a large degree. And over the years, I began to realize that the things that I was doing in my life were ones that were indicative of some leadership qualities. Like I chose, when I finished high school to, move 1,000 miles away to go to college, going somewhere where I knew no one, because that was something that was important to me, knowing that education was important, but stepping out there in that way is something that is a little bit different for somebody who, people would put in a box of being an introvert, right? So I share that to say often leadership comes in different packages, right? And we can bring different skills and who we are to that role. And so that leads to the question of what does good leadership look like and involve? So Linda, what do you think? What does good leadership look like and involve?
One of the things that I think I've most admired in folks that have been my mentors or my supervisors is this roll up your sleeves attitude and get the work done, that there's no task that's too small for you as a leader. We all have to pitch in. Doesn't matter how much education we have or what our title says. Sometimes we all need to just be pitching in because an emergency happens, or because I think it also shows and as an example to others that we expect that, we value that kind of nimbleness and your flexibility to take up that challenge. I think that's really important. The other thing I think that's really important is listening to others, being transparent, about the information. I don't want to hoard information. And so I assume when I share information, it will be shared with others because most of what I know is not highly confidential. And there's no reason why we should hoard that. I think lastly too is being able to admit when you make mistakes or that things are challenging for you. I have said in various forums that if I ever say that I know it all or that I have all the answers, please fire me because we don't know it all. We don't have all the answers. And I think it's important to ask for help and ask for support from others. And so I'm very lucky to be in a space where and gender-based violence of women and girls, there are a lot of exemplary women leaders, and they are always willing to offer advice or provide suggestions. And I am grateful to them, and I hope I can be a resource as well.
I can chime in because I agree with a lot of what Linda said. I do believe that transparency is very important. I also believe that being able to admit when you're wrong or when you don't know is also very important as a leader. And oftentimes we're not shown that side of leadership because it involves being vulnerable. And I think vulnerability is a big part of leadership as well. I would say being empathetic to not only the team that you support and that supports you, but to the groups of people who you're in service to as well is extremely important, as well as being able to lift people along as you go. And I think oftentimes, leadership can be very isolating and very lonely at times. And so being able to surround yourself with people who know more than you or who are gifted in other skill sets or training that you're not just helps everybody to sort of lift boats as we all rise, as well as learn from each other. And I think that that's extremely important as a leader. I think I mentioned this as we were getting to know each other, but growing up in a sort of a faith-based community taught me the value of servant leadership, and that truly we are not in positions to glorify ourselves and to put ourselves on a pedestal, but rather to be a voice and advocates for other people. And so really learning how to use that platform and that perspective and access that you get as a leader to open up doors and opportunities and help fill seats around the table with others who would not have these opportunities had you not been able to open them for them, I think is extremely important as a leader, and we don't see enough of that, but I think that is the trend that we should start to see in leadership that will really help us to move some of these needles forward that we're hoping to see in our lifetime.
Like I 100% agree
Yes.
with what Linda and Brittany has said. And if I may say, just add a little bit to that, reflecting back in my own personal journey, 3 things really came to my mind as an important qualities of a leader, which are ability to build trust and getting buy-ins from your team and your supporters. And secondly, ability to develop others as leaders also came to me as a very important quality because, again, it's not all about me. It's not all about putting the assets and investment on myself. It's all about growing the team together and encouraging others to be the leaders. And then lastly, I think everyone here will agree, the ability to develop, the ability to adapt to a changing environment. Now, let's talk about all the things that have happened in the past 5+ years, Illinois going through budget impasse, all the social injustice issues, anti-Asian immigration, hate crimes rising, and the COVID, talk about all these very uncertainties. But I think as a good leader, you just have to take all these challenges as an opportunity to do something different and constantly think outside of the box.
Great, thank you. Well, Melissa, I think we've been set up well for you to talk to us a little bit and give us a little bit of a framework, just kind of making these connections with some of the intersectionality piece that you do so well.
Thank you, Pia. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm going to share a couple slides just to set the stage. So bear with me as I set this up. Okay, great. And then slideshow. Okay. So as Pierre said, intersectionality is my bread and butter. I use the intersectional framework to study organizations and to study the experiences of women of color. And so what we wanted to do here is just give you the history because it's such a popular word and most people don't understand where it comes from. Okay, so intersectionality was coined in 1989 by Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a legal scholar at Columbia at the moment. And what she was trying to understand was why Black women were struggling in cases of workforce discrimination. And what she found by reviewing cases is two things. First, she found that when Black women tried to use gender bias or discrimination, they lost their cases because white women weren't going through the same thing. And when they tried race, they also lost because Black men weren't going through what they were going through, right? And so she really wanted to create this concept or coin this concept that really got to what was missing in legal policy to really have, to create an avenue for change and advocacy for the experiences of Black women, right? And so that's where the term comes from. It's been used in a variety of industries in a variety of different ways to then include not just Black women, but also other women of color and other marginalized identities, right? So when we think about the term, and when I talk about it, for me, it's really important to go back to its roots, i.e. Black women have been trying to make sense of their invisibility in various social systems. And what Kimberly Crenshaw just gave us in 1989, it was this really nice term to capture it and then to think about how does this inform how we understand leadership, how we understand work, and other things, right? And so one of the things I've spent my career doing is trying to translate this concept that was about social policy into like how we understand work in organizations. So to do that, I just thought I would go over some of the key themes because of A, what our panelists have said, and two, to set the stage for the rest of the panel today. So first, let me do this again. So first, we want to think about multidimensional identities. Again, the term was coined to center Black women and make Black women visible, but it's not just race and gender. We also have to think about ability. We have to think about immigration status. We have to think about nation of origin, right? Because it's these intersections that, as the women just discussed, really shape where people come from and where the journey starts, right? And when we're thinking about that, we also want to think to Pierre's question about this question of visibility. What does a leader look like, right? And when we think about the way the women have just discussed journeys, right? Which journeys are more visible and how do these journeys inform what is known and what's being done in our organizations, right? When I think about the importance of women of color in nonprofits, right? Especially with women like the ones we have on the panel and where their stories start, right? There's so much richness in how they navigated the world. And they bring that richness into these nonprofits to solve social issues. But the question is, are we recognizing all of that knowledge, right? Then lastly, right, resource allocation. Again, women of color, what they've had to navigate in terms of racism, sexism, how they manage families, how they manage the extended networks, right? We have to think, when we bring them into our organizations, what resources are we giving women of color, both our employees and clients, right, to help them be their full selves. And then lastly, this question of belonging, right? So women of color and other marginalized groups come in with all this knowledge based on how they navigate the world. To various degrees, we recognize their talent and their expertise and how important their journey is to get to where they are, and how important it is for organizations. And so how do we create ways to make those journeys visible and valuable to the organization, and also allow our clients and employees to really feel a sense of belonging where they work and in the organizations they're being served? Thank you.
Be nice to take myself off mute. So thank you, Melissa. I think that that was a helpful context because you're right, that term intersectionality gets thrown around a lot. And it's helpful to think about where it came from and how it can be useful, and that we are complex individuals. All of those different identities come into play when we are in our roles of human beings, but then also in various titles, in various capacities in organizations. And I think, to folks in our audience, just understanding, and I think I started with that in the beginning, that we have undergraduate students, we have graduate students, we have folks who are working in nonprofit organizations, maybe in other kinds of organizations. There's different subsectors represented. And sometimes people don't think of themselves as a leader because of what we have been told leadership looks like or acts like or sounds like. And that can be a real limitation that we need to begin to move away from. So looking at that from another perspective, there's a question, where do we learn in our personal journeys? Where have we learned some lessons about leadership? If we think about our families or, our ancestors, grandparents, other family members, perhaps, what lessons have we heard that have been significant that we can draw upon? So if anyone would like to share any thoughts or stories, that would be great.
So I'll go ahead and start. So I've been lucky enough to be in the not-for-profit space since I was 4 years old, having grown up with someone who started their own not-for-profit. And I think that kind of really created a frame by which I felt you can do anything. If you have a vision or of how to help the community or start your own business, anything is possible. And I never felt that being a woman was a detriment in any way in my life. And I think that was because, coupled with that experience, I was exposed to so many brilliant women, whether they were teachers. Growing up with teacher parents is always a unique experience. Growing up with people in the arts who were leaders in their own capacity. I think that really helped me believe that anything was possible. But I'd also say that I admire, my immigrant background, the fact that my parents came to this country, particularly my mom. My mother's only has family that is her own children and her husband. She still has been here since the 70s. And to think that she has done, made her life here is amazing. And she's one of many people who've had that immigrant experience and leaving their home. I also think that just thinking about in terms of my ancestors, I've had many women in our family who have been single moms who tragically lost their husbands and they had to raise their children. And so I think that, hearing their stories, it just teaches me resilience and how I need to create my own way of taking care of myself, but also recognizing that I'm much more powerful than I ever imagined. And my capacity to endure is greater than I ever give myself credit for. And I think that really helps me in many ways, learning those stories. And so I'm very grateful when women share themselves with others and about their journeys, because I always find it very inspirational, whether they're part of my family or not. I think that I enjoy learning those stories, but also I find them completely inspirational, particularly from the women that we serve.
Great, thank you. Brittany, Irene.
Yeah, I can follow up next. I think for me and my leadership journey, I think I learned a lot of what type of leader I wanted to be by seeing examples of leadership that I didn't resonate with. And that I couldn't necessarily agree with or weren't aligned with sort of who I was as an individual. And so in seeing those leaders and how they lead and how they manage teams and how they work with other groups and individuals, it helped me to see like, okay, I would not like to do that. And I don't like how this makes me feel. So I don't want to create space where someone could feel like that in my organization or in my interactions that I have with folks. So a lot of my leadership journey has been sort of crafting my own lane and building my own path. I do remember when I started my journey as a CEO, I kept looking for an example, a role model, somebody, a mentor, right, who sort of mirrored my passion, my energy, my approach. And I struggled to find that. And so in that, it was me recognizing that if you don't see it, be it, and create that, because there's likely someone else that's coming after you that's looking for the same thing. And if it's not currently modeled the way that you want to see it modeled, be that for someone else. And so I think through that journey, I started to attract more like minds and more people who I do resonate with and more people who I could learn from. And so one of the things, sort of going back to what Linda was saying, is just that resilience and growing up in a household that's mostly female dominated, but seeing women always in sort of submissive roles and not necessarily pursuing their passions or going after their ambition, really just recognizing that I want to be that example for people that come after me. And so I think a lot of it, not to say they were negative connotations, but they were just different, different. And so now I like to, again, create that lane for others. I think the other thing that I have learned from the mentors that I have now gained in my journey is that imposter syndrome is not real. And I think, for so many women of color in particular, we get in some of these spaces and we don't feel like we belong because for so long we've been shut out of these spaces. We haven't had access to them. And then when we are at the table, we're usually silenced. And so it can build up a lot of imposter syndrome and thinking that you're not supposed to be there or you're not credentialed enough or qualified enough to lead in the ways that you know to be true for yourself. And so I have learned through my journey, a lot of people that are in positions of power actually don't know what they're doing. And when you can start to reframe that in your mind, that we're all here figuring this out. This is all our first time here and our first time doing this. And everybody is sort of learning as they go. It starts to sort of enhance that capability inside of yourself, tune out the noise, and really just help you to stay focused on what you know to be true about yourself, your skills, and how you want to show up. So for me, that's sort of been my journey through leadership.
When I began my journey in the nonprofit 20 years ago, you look around, all the Korean social service organizations and most ethnic organizations were led by male leaders. After 20 years, you look around, I know a lot of women have stepped up. I know many of my partner organizations that I had worked with many years, now we're very proud to see women leaders, women executive directors. But still, I think one common issue that we hear all the time is the very little guidance and mentorship for women leaders, women of colors, and especially Asian women. It's an Asian woman. So I think investing in investment for the next generation, making more women leadership present and visible is definitely something that we need to all work on. That's why I'm also part of an organization that actually focuses on women mentorship for young professionals, people in nonprofit and other fields. So I think this is something that we should all continue to work on. And I just want to add that I also think of my senior clients, my elderly clients as my mentors. Every day I work with them, I talk to them, and their resilience, their richness of their history, their immigrant life history, and how they made their life made in here in the US, it just amazes me every day. So those are very inspirational. They are my inspirational mentors as well.
Great, thank you. So I'm just looking at the Q&A box here. So Jackie said, I love the realization that we're all just here learning as we go. Even the most confident person can feel she doesn't belong. That is true. Yeah. So we have to deal with that, the voices in our heads, which then connects with Amy had said something that just connects with all of this. And she said, to riff on Pierre's question about what you learned from others, now as respected leaders, what would you tell your younger self that you wish you'd known? So we've all arrived, right? So what would we tell our younger selves that we wish we had known then? Impossible, but now we can have that dream.
I'll start. I think that there's not only one way to do things. I think that once I graduated from college and was more exposed to positions of power or people that held power, I assumed that there was only one way to do things. And for the most part, it's the white male way of doing things. And I wish I had known that that wasn't the only way. Because I think I felt that I had to assimilate or change myself to adopt that way, but I never felt comfortable. And so I think that I wish I had known then that you can be part of that change. And so that's what's really wonderful, I think, about these generations coming out of college, or the youth that we have today, that they're willing to shake things up. They're willing to question more than I think our generation did. And not to say that our generation didn't lead the way in many ways. I'm Generation X. But I think I would have loved to have known that there wasn't only one way of doing things. And whatever business you are, either it's corporate or you're running your own business or it's a not-for-profit, there are multiple ways to be a leader. There are multiple ways to commence a project. And I think that that's something that I wish I had known, because I think I was scared to question. Something felt unfamiliar or uncomfortable, and feeling that you're alone when you're one of the few people of color in a room, a few immigrant Americans, a few women, a few people who actually speak another language, you feel that you can't question that authority as much. And I think that that's something that now you don't see that kind of reluctance, because there's more of us. But I also think that we realize as communities of color that we need to push those boundaries and speak to power. And I think that's very welcoming, I think, for, in my own journey, but also it makes me feel really excited to see what the younger generations will accomplish.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. It makes me think, so I'm a baby boomer generation. And one of the, talk about, what you hear from family members, my family was supportive, my father was supportive, but his philosophy was get to the table and then you do whatever. So if you're talking about change, you kind of hold your authentic self aside until you get to wherever, right? And then you assert who you are. And so I think that kind of went into my development and my style, which is more kind of a diplomatic approach rather than coming in and seeking to change from the very beginning. So Linda, to your point about, appreciating, younger generations who are not as patient, perhaps, and just say, look, I don't like this, it's got to change. And Brittany, you were talking about seeing models around you that were not satisfactory. So you decided to come in and create your own or draw from other models, not necessarily what you saw around you. That's something that's really important to support as well. Let's see, what else do we have in the box here? So there's a question, many of you have mentioned mentors. How do new women leaders find the right mentor?
Go ahead, Melissa. Okay, kick us off. Because this was such a challenge for me as a young woman in a new space, finding mentors, because I wanted a mentor that looked like me. I wanted a mentor that mirrored sort of my journey. And what I found in the first probably 3 years of running my own nonprofit is so many of, particularly Black women, but women of color, are so stretched that they don't have the capacity to mentor. And so that was really disheartening for me. But then now that I'm here in this space, I get it, right? Is we're wearing so many hats, we're leading in so many different spaces. There are so few of us that get these opportunities, right? That it is very difficult for folks to, find the time and prioritize mentorship. What I will say is what helped me is to get really clear on what I wanted a mentor for. I think we throw that term around and think that it's just a nice to have, where being sort of mutually aligned on what it is you need and what you're looking for from a mentor, as well as like your expectations on what you want that relationship to look like, make it a little easier for you to sort of find and source the people that you're looking for. I think the other thing that also really helped me in my own journey was, regardless of having a mentor or not, doing the work, right? So when you get a chance to secure that mentor, you already have a track record, and as I call them, receipts for things that you've done and how you've shown up and the work that you've been able to do sans mentor, so that they understand and see that by partnering with you and by lending their expertise, it's just going to help take you to the next level. And so I think just keeping that frame of reference in mind is that people are busy, right? People don't have a lot of time. And so when you are looking for support support from someone, just being very clear on what those expectations are, what your needs are, but then how you can provide value and sort of help them maximize their time as they're spending it with you has been really helpful for me as I've sort of amassed mentors over the years.
And another way of looking at that, there's something that people call a personal board or a kitchen cabinet. And the idea of, Brittany, you were talking about being really clear what you are looking for in a particular mentor, but just the idea that you can have more than one person at the same time. And that you can then be very clear, this is the person that I would like to talk with about the politics of what's going on in my organization. This is a person that I would like to talk about conflict. This is a person that I would like to talk about as I'm thinking about my career trajectory. And so there can be different people for different purposes. And, if you're looking for one person that is just like you in certain ways, that's one person, but there may be others that you can put together in this personal board who may not be like you in some other ways, but you can learn from because of certain kinds of experiences that they've had. So that's something that I found is another kind of way of looking at mentorship as a possibility. I also want to just give a shout out to, a couple things. Chicago Foundation for Women has Willie's Warriors program, and I'm on that advisory board. And, the idea there is really working with a cohort of Black women around leadership possibilities, just, based on the leadership from Reverend Willie Barrow, who was, a significant leader for justice in Chicago. So that's one. And then I used to be part of Chicago Women of Philanthropy's mentorship program for women, which is another significant opportunity and program that's in Chicago. And I know all around the country, there are different kinds of programs that women can look to, different organizations where you can look for those kinds of resources.
I want to jump in right here.
Okay.
On what you both have said. I think Brittany outlined a laundry list of things to start with. I also want to take a step back and connect it to the last question. One of the things I knew that took me a long time as a first generation, a lot of things, was feeling worthy to ask for help, right? And when I think about the spaces I've had access to throughout my education and my profession, right? Like when we are scholarship kids or when we are like the first one to enter a space, there's this like imposter syndrome to a certain degree, right? But as someone who paid attention to all the data on women of color in school and et cetera, I was like, I'm lucky to be in the room, right? And then, so my advice is to think about, no, we're not lucky to be in the room. You're lucky to have me in the room, because what I'm going to have to endure to navigate these predominantly white spaces, I don't have the energy to that's too many hours to talk about the dimensions. Having said that, but once we're in the room, right, to go back to something Pierre said about getting a seat at the table, I think what a lot of us take for granted, especially when we're the firsts or the onlys, is that we can actually build a table. I think we have 3 panelists who built their own tables. And so what does it mean to give ourselves the authority, because we're brilliant, to build the table and to invite others, right? Because the thing is, and when I think of the first generation college students I've talked to, or young women of color who are a lot of us being raised by single moms, how do I do it? I was like, your story is impressive. Our decision, our proactive decision to enter spaces where we're not a lot of, right, is such a huge lift. And it's one of the scariest things, I'm sure everyone in this panel would agree, that we have ever done. Having said that, there's a lot of people who, when you get in the room, want to know your story and want to invest in you, right? And so the trick is, which is tricky, and I'm sure each panelist can speak to this, is how do you find the person who wants to help you? And like Brittany said, they may not look like what you think, but that doesn't mean they're not going to be useful. And I really encourage when we think about mentors and sponsors, and Brittany, I think, said this beautifully, is think about what you need and where you need mentorship in. Peer mentors have definitely helped me in my career, right? And I remember when I first met Pierre, was it 6 or 7 years ago? I was like, oh, she understands me, she gets it. We're in our careers have taken different journeys. However, the advice I got in the few conversations I had with her, right? Were transformative. And it could be your mentorship is a 20-minute conversation, or it could be a multi-year relationship. And that's okay too. But I really think every time I come across a young person And I'm like, what do you want? And my boss, she's like, you can't ask them that question. I was like, but I should, because they have a right to define what they want, because there's so much messaging that we're getting about what's good and what's right. And unfortunately, like what's good, what people think is good, the conventional definition of good may not work for everyone. So to give young people the opportunity to define what they want and who they want to be, I think is at the trick. And once we as individuals get to do that, I think we're better able to find mentorships and sponsors who allow us to become our best selves.
Great, thank you. So Jessica said, I appreciate the background on intersectionality. So her question is, what in the panel's experience are the unique challenges that women of color experience in transitioning from management to executive leadership? So there are many folks who have, worked in organizations and moved up through the ranks, perhaps into management positions. And I know it happens a lot. I've seen that a lot in social work, because I went to social work school way back when. And so people who become social workers become, the manager of other social workers, become the executive director. There's some transition. And sometimes if you're in the same organization also, there can be challenges. How do you leave your peers behind, so to speak? Because, you used to hang out and go to lunch or complain about the executive director, and now you are the executive director. And so the relationship is a little bit different, right? So what are some thoughts about those transitions?
So Pierre, I think you just described my my journey. Began as a coordinator, right after getting my MSW, right? And then promoted to program director, deputy director, and so forth. And then finally here I am as the executive director. So, and I also at the time was probably the youngest person in the organization as well. So there were a lot of older employees that I had to manage. And also in terms of number of experience, there are many people who had longer experience than me. So all of those really were at one point very big challenge for me. How do I deal with? But to keep the answer short, I think it's just this genuine mindset of supporting. I'm here to help you. Whether I was a coordinator position or a director position or executive director, doesn't matter. I'm here to help you and support. And our goal is to get our vision and mission completed for the organization. That genuineness, honesty, and transparency, I think was just one thing that, got me through all these challenges. Of course, I wouldn't say it was always as easy and as pretty as what one might think, but just keep true to yourself. And then as a leader, you just have to bring everyone back to the common shared goals and values. And one thing that I ended up doing at the beginning of my ED role was coming up with a whole new set of core values for the entire organization, which involved everyone from staff members to all the way up to the board. So that now in our organization, we know whichever position you're at, how long you've been with the organization, we're all held accountable for the 5 core values, which is passion, trust, teamwork, fairness, and acceptance. So I think that's how I would explain my experience. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you.
I'll just add something really quickly. So I came to Mujeres the first time after I left law. I think I mentioned that earlier. And then I left, and 8 years later, I came back, and I'm the CEO president. And there were still a lot of friends here who were my peers, or that people I was reporting to me. So it was a difficult transition, but I really like Irene's approach and the way she described it, that we have to support each other. I think one of the benefits of mentorship is that I believe I need to be a mentor towards others, not holding onto information, being transparent, asking them, how can I support you? What do you need to grow? What is your path that I can help you navigate? Because people did that for me. So I really believe it's about paying it forward. And I think that I also recognize I have a lot of privilege, not just because of the position I'm in, but because I'm not a first generation college student. And I grew up in a middle class home where a lot was given to me. And so I am so lucky that my parents always told us, you're spoiled. What are you going to do for your community? And this has been really, I think, really kind of the centerpiece for the way, my siblings and I think is that we all have our way of contributing back. And this is my way. This is my road. And so I think I always am reminded about that, is that how can I share? I think the other thing I would say is find your mentors. And I noticed in the chat, somebody said like horizontal networking. I have found folks who are executive directors or VPs of other not-for-profits, and I turn to them. When I have a question, I am not ashamed, or I am not fearful in any way of asking, hey, do you know so-and-so who can support with this? I am dealing with this kind of situation. Can you give me some information? And I tell others that I reached out to so-and-so, again, because I recognize I don't have all the answers. So let's seek them out. Let's find out from others. And I would have to say that overwhelmingly, most of the individuals who support me are women of color. They're not just Latinas, they're Asians, they're Black, they're South Asian. And I'm so grateful to them for being so generous of that. And I hope that I will continue to, to follow their path and be generous with my time and any advice that I can offer as well.
Great. So there's a kind of connecting question that I can raise, and that is from Jonna. And she says, I'm really inspired to see women leaders in the social justice and nonprofit sector who transition to being elected officials. So not sure about our panel, but if anyone can speak to whether or not you've thought about this for yourself, going into the elected arena. We can keep that short or say a little bit more, whatever.
I don't know that we have anything, but I know Melissa wanted to say something from the last question.
Oh, okay.
Thanks. As someone who studies this for a living, right, why women aren't climbing the corporate ladder, I think Irene and Linda shared their own personal journey, and I appreciate that. But I also want to point to the structure of work and how in a lot of cases, the talent of women of color is not valued and not appreciated, because the assumptions based on what women of color are capable of is super low. And then women of color have to navigate like a lot of things like tokenism, and we can talk about the angry woman of color syndrome, right? When we start to ask for things and how assertiveness and agency gets penalized among women of color. So it's a nuanced problem, but it really is a question of like, if you're at an organization, how are they valuing the various ways women of color are contributing? To what extent are they being supported? Because we can talk about finding mentors and sponsors, but I think it really starts with the question of what's it called? Like, are my talents being recognized? And if they're not, can I leave? And really quickly, a quick story. I was talking to a mentee this morning who recently like transitioned industry and transitions jobs, and she's been in her new job for a month. She was like, it's really interesting. Like, I like my colleagues, and I didn't realize that I could leave a toxic workplace, right? She was a first generation, she's documented, she's a first generation professional. And she just thought, you get a job, you do the job, and you keep your job, right? I know my mom was raised like that. And, but more and more, I think because of the structure of the economy and a lot of different things, I think we need to give ourselves permission to be like, where can I grow as a professional, and who's going to sustain and feed my talents and let them grow? Thanks, Brittany.
Thanks.
Pierre, I will quickly try to answer what you asked a few moments ago.
Okay, that was a Jonna question.
Yeah, sorry, Joanna's wonderful question. I have a lot of respect for, elected officials like Selena Villanueva, who's a state senator, as well as Dagmara Avelar, who is a state rep. And they came from not-for-profits that were social justice. And what's wonderful for someone like me who does advocacy work, but also providing social service, is that they get it. So of course we want to see more individuals who are elected officials or coming from our community and have been in the not-for-profit space, either as somebody who has been an employee or somebody who's a board member. I think that's fantastic. But, I was asked early in my career, because I love to read about politics. I love political podcasts. I watch a lot of political shows. Like, you loved, reading and knowing about this. Have you ever thought about entering yourself? And I think what I realized very early on is that I like to push people to understand my position and advocate. And I think elected officials can be advocates, but they have to compromise too. And they have to be elected by a diverse group of people with many interests. I have very particular interests working at a not-for-profit and working on behalf of my community, and I like that. So I think that this is not to say that, and I encourage people who work from not-for-profits, especially women of color, to enter into the political, the political environment. But they have to recognize too is that what do they like about the work that they're doing, and is it the right role for them? How do they want to make a difference? Because there's no right or wrong answer. And I think it's when that person figures that out, the best of luck to them.
Great, thank you. So there's another question. As leaders, how do we overcome the queen bee syndrome when there's only a few spots at the table for women? So we're all out for ourselves rather than for the collective. Thoughts?
I have thoughts, if that's okay.
Yes.
I'll try to keep it brief. I think as women, we have to, this might be controversial, assess our internalized sexism, right? Every time I'm on a panel regarding any dimension of diversity, and it's always like, well, how do we get white men involved? I was like, no, before we get that, how do we see what's really right next to us, right? And I think, like, as Linda said, women have been my biggest advocate, my biggest allies, and my biggest accomplices, right? And I don't take up space without providing space for other women. And so the question is like, what about my situation like allows me to let this happen? Every time I teach, every time I talk to a young person, and every time I talk to a professional, and this question comes up, it's like, why are you so mad at other women? It's not other women. This is systemic. How do we give room to account for like how broken the system is, that we are literally shooting our sisters in the foot because we are sisters in the struggle, and we don't talk about that enough.
If I could
Thank you.
If I could piggyback on that,
Yes.
I think a lot of it is a human systemic issue, right? And it comes from this sort of scarcity mentality, is that there's not enough for all of us. And it's absolutely not true. There is plenty, it's just distributed unevenly and unequally.
Yes.
I think now as things begin to shift and you're starting to see more women of color and more people of color getting access and seats at the table and resources, it's really important for us to remember that if one of us wins, we all win, right? And so by, again, collaboration and being able to share resources and, again, pull someone up as you go along, it's just going to collectively help us, again, to lift others' boats as we rise. And that's where the power and the magic is, because the more we're bringing along with us, the more those dynamics and those power dynamics start to shift, because there's more representation of the people who need to be at those tables at the tables. And you can't shoulder that responsibility alone. And the thing that I learned in my own journey is the access that I get, I could not use all of these resources myself if I wanted to. So for me to hoard those and to hoard relationships and access and resources, it is truly selfish. And there's so much more to go around. And so being able to help the next person and really being able to again, build community and collaboration, it truly is only going to help us in the long run. So I think that's something we have to continue to keep at the forefront of our mind, is there's plenty to go around. The more that we're able to build this table and it be reflective of who needs to be in the room, it's going to benefit everybody.
Those are great points. Just the idea that there are numerous resources, but they're just distributed in the wrong way. And, the other side of that about creating our own tables. And so, Brittany, that's something you've done in a sense by creating your own organization. So that's an approach that folks take sometimes, but also we are at these different points in organizations or have ties to different organizations, and we can share much more so. And so a lot of it is how we think about ourselves and others. And, if we think about sharing rather than, as you were saying, Brittany, this scarcity mentality, which is also not true, not real, that it just turns things around. And so we have to begin to think differently. So that connects with just a question about what has changed over the course of your career in terms of leadership opportunities and complexities for women. What's been the same? I think we've kind of answered it, but there may be something more to be said about it. leadership for women? Things that are the same, things that may have changed.
I would say that I've noticed in a lot of leadership programs, particularly for communities of color, understandably concentrating a lot on youth and first generation college students, first generation professionals. And I think that is absolutely brilliant. But I would love to see more leadership programs for women of color who are not educated, who have not had those opportunities to seek a trade or go to college. They took care of their children, they worked 3 jobs. That's something that I think that slowly but surely, I hope with this reckoning of our country on racial equity as well as social justice, that we begin to invest more on those leaders that we don't traditionally lift up. And so one thing that we do at Mujeres Latinas is we have a Latina leadership program, and we work with predominantly immigrant women. Many are survivors of gender-based violence. Many are Spanish dominant, do not have completed a high school education, many not even a middle school education in their native country. And we help them by providing them the skills and the political education so that they can lead in various capacities on the campaigns that we work on, and talking to the media and representing their own story, but also that of the community. And I think that's something that we need to be more attention to that, that its leadership is not just college educated people with master's degrees or doctorates. Everyone has the potential to be a leader. And when we provide them that capacity, I think there will be more social change. Because when people will look at me, they're like, well, you made it, right? You're a success, and Mujeres, most of our staff are college educated, first generation. Many of them have master's degrees. They're seeking licenses and other kind of certification programs, which is wonderful. And that's a success. But we have to have other ways of not measuring success, but acknowledging success. And I think that's something that, because so many of our women in our communities are not college educated and had not opportunities, we're robbing them of that opportunity to share their voice and lift them up. And so I think that's something that we need to concentrate a lot more on.
That's a really important point. Go on, Melissa.
I also wanted to say to that point, like, as someone with my grandmother who never made it past the 3rd grade, in many ways is a lot smarter than I am, right? I know that, I recognize that, and every time I recognize my smallness and compared to her bigness. Having said that, to go back to piggyback off what Linda is saying, when I think about the immigrant women I interviewed as part of the dissertation on immigrant serving nonprofits, right? What I found was that the women who knew the most were the ones who were on the ground in these contract roles, who were running things, knew everybody, knew how to map the system, but they weren't getting compensated, let alone running these organizations. Right. And so again, I have more degrees than than anybody. But having said that, degrees don't make brilliance. Experience makes brilliance. These connections make brilliance. And so I appreciate the idea of lifting up. But I think even before lifting up, we have to recognize that the education system is just one dimension of knowledge. And if we don't listen to the elders who literally built the world that we exist in, right? Because when I think, especially the immigrant journey, what it takes to come into this country and accept maybe that your degrees from your home country don't translate, or accept that there's this language barrier and still persist, we need to recognize how valuable that is in the nonprofit sector.
Yes. Amen.
If I could just piggyback on both of those points, I think we've made leadership sort of this heady, unattainable concept, that if you can only do leadership or know about leadership or have access to leadership if you went to a certain school, or if you went through a certain leadership development training program or work at a certain company. And what this whole experience through COVID has taught me is that leadership is a concept that everyone needs to be more familiar with and learn their power in that, because we're all leaders, right? We all have our own spheres of influence that we can be influential within. And so if folks can be more empowered to lead, even if they're not in a CEO position, but in their families, in the conversations that they have with people around them, I think that is something that we should start to think about and think about how we change that. And I think the other piece of this is going back to Linda's point, is we really have to do more work around supporting those people who don't have access. I think oftentimes these fellowship programs and opportunities are created for the same groups of people that continue to get access and are going to succeed regardless if they have that or not. And then the same groups of people continue to get shut out because the opportunities are not necessarily crafted for them. And so I think we have to be more mindful as leaders as we create opportunities and programs. Who is the group that continues to get shut out? Where is the needle not moving forward? Who are the people that feel intimidated by these things that we create because they feel like they're not ready, or they're not credentialed enough, or they're not smart enough to be in the room? We have to start creating access and opportunities for those folks too, because that's, again, the only way that we're going to start to see collectively the needle move for all of us versus that top 10%.
Yes, that's a great point. That is, because there are so many resources that are available, but in a sense, they're redundant. And just changing the way that we look at leadership is something that needs to happen, but it requires us thinking differently, having these conversations, but thinking very differently and acknowledging. And Melissa, you were talking about, your grandmother is smarter in a lot of ways than you are, but just recognizing how people can exercise leadership in their lives on a daily basis. But because of a lack of title or degree or what have you, it gets ignored as opposed to being elevated. And I think nonprofit organizations in various communities perhaps have an opportunity to draw upon that, because if you're on the ground in communities and get to know folks that present, these kinds of skills and are connected in different networks and can be strengthened in different ways. I mean, that's one of the ways that it might be able to happen. And I'm sure, and I think, Linda, you mentioned, and Irene as well, the ways that you're doing it. Brittany, you're working with young folks. So it's, kind of bringing people up as they are being educated, but those are our different approaches that we can take. Jessica says she loves everything Dr. Abad had said. So this is from a little while ago. The question, how can we overcome the overwhelming sense and the scrutiny when we do have a seat at the table? So this is kind of going back to that question. When we are at these tables and may feel some anxiety, what can we do? And I think some tips have already been shared about realizing that we're not in it by ourselves and looking at ways that we can reach out to be authentic, be transparent, and talk to each other, and realize that we don't know it all. Ask questions, ask for help. I mean, that's one of the things, or several of the things that can happen. There may be some other tips that folks want to share.
I'll share one if that's okay.
Sure.
Or maybe more than one. I know one of the things I do, because I'm normally the only one or the first one in a lot of the spaces I'm in. And so every time I'm in a weird situation, when it comes to either before the table or at the table, the number of times I reach into to Peter's point, my advisory board, and either practice what I'm going to say, get advice on what I'm going to say, advice on how to frame it, right? Because sometimes I'm direct and angry, and California doesn't do direct communication. So I have spent a lot of time having to translate Chicago speak to California speak. So it's reaching out to your advisory board, practicing what you say, getting perspectives on what other people, and how other people interpret what you say so you can deliver it, right? And really in reaching out to your people, your advisory board or what have you, that's actually how you build your own table, right? And that becomes the table you go back to regroup, to recover, to rest, and to get empowered.
Thank you. Panelists?
I'll just add a quick note here and just be confident in yourself. I think we're already doing the work. Most of us are doing the work. And so the credibility is there. It's already there, whether or not you've received accolades for it or you've been asked to speak on panels. You are a subject matter expert in what you're doing. And so be confident in that. The other piece of it is just push through. I think, again, for a lot of us who this is our first time at the table, this is our first time having the opportunity to vocalize how we feel and what we want to see and what we want changed. It's very uncomfortable and it makes us feel a way, but pushing through that uncomfortability gets you the practice that you need to grow that confidence in yourself. And so you may not always get it right. It may not be the most eloquent delivery, but speak up, advocate for yourself, advocate for those people around you. And I think that muscle just continues to grow as you practice that, that confidence and just showing up for yourself and showing up how you want to be represented in those spaces.
Great, thank you. So Vaniel really wants us to speak a little bit more about the mentor situation. And so has asked, how do you find a mentor that is right for you? So I think in our conversation already, there have been some suggestions, but it's not something that is going to happen automatically necessarily, right? So do panelists want to speak to how you found a mentor, in addition to if there are other folks in the audience who would like to drop something into the chat about any additional resources for finding mentors? That would be great.
Yeah, I would say even me as an executive director, I'm still in process of finding new mentors, right? And I'm talking about mentors not only from the nonprofit sector. I would love to connect with people from various different sectors so that I can learn from other side of the world, what they are thinking and how things are done. So going back to how to find a great mentor, it doesn't happen. Like Pierre, you said, it doesn't happen just automatically. You have to actually spend the time. You have to invest in it. You have to make yourself open to meeting different kinds of people all the time. I think without that extra effort and investment, it won't really happen. And one organization that I mentioned earlier is called Korean Women's International Network that I'm part of. And what we are focused on is really identifying Korean American women mentors and have them available for any young professionals that are wanting to connect with people like them. So again, seek out these different organizations and entities, and don't be afraid to ask for connections. Sometimes connections happens from here to there, and then it reaches you until you get to the right connection. Keep asking, and then you sometimes get there. And as an executive director, I recently been offered by my board actually to invest a little bit in paid coaching service. So I know everybody's in a position where they could actually pay for those kind of services, but that's also another available resources. If you're really all about getting external feedbacks and support, there are even people that are professionally doing coaching and mentoring for you. Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you can just have different conversations with people that you already know. If folks know that that's something that you're interested in, they may have ideas, or you might just kind of change the nature of the conversation with someone and have it be focused on an issue that's of concern to you. And then you start to realize that you can get some insights from that person, but you never thought about that person as a mentor, because again, sometimes we have certain ideas in our heads about what a mentor is supposed to be. And if it's simply, somebody who can be a sounding board for you, or someone who can share ideas about resources. So there are different ways, and various of the panelists have talked about that. It's not necessarily finding 10 things in one person, but if you are clear about the questions that you have and begin to look to places or people that you can ask those questions, you might not get an answer from that person, but you may get another person that can make a suggestion. I know often students, when they're looking for job opportunities, for example, I say, not just looking for a particular job, but think about having informational interviews. So sometimes going to or exploring an organization where your interest is, or you're interested in the mission, is one of the steps that can happen along that journey of finding a person that you can talk to about an interest that you have, a job opportunity, the kind of job that you think you might be interested in. And that experience may lead you to a person who you could talk to more, who could end up being a mentor. Going to professional conferences or meetings of professional associations, depending upon what your interest is another way to find groups of people where you may have some common interests. Those are just some additional thoughts.
Can I also add that another excellent way is joining an associate board? I think that is something that, you know, not having the governing responsibilities, but you're all in it together. You're coming from different walks of life, different careers. And I think there's a lot of value to be had in peer mentors because at least, you know, coming out of law, most of my friends are not in the not-for-profit spectrum, they're in corporate. And I listen very intently when they talk about things that are going on because there are lessons learned that can happen and that can be shared in terms of my own experiences. So as whenever possible, I know that one a participant today wrote that they belong to the Young Women's Giving Council Chicago Foundation for Women. There are a lot of examples like that, whether philanthropic or not-for-profit based. And I would encourage individuals to join them because you really do begin to begin friendships and then find out that they have a lot of ways of supporting you and information that they can share.
And so Melissa has dropped into the chat a number of really helpful tips. I'm not going to read it all because I think everybody can see the chat, but she says to summarize steps discussed so far on the panel on how to find mentors, identify what you need, what are you working towards, starting with people close to you and discuss the needs with them. They could offer information or offer somebody else, following connections, attending networking events, workshops on the topic you're interested in. So that's a really great summary of some of the process that can be followed with that question of finding mentors. Irene?
And also volunteer.
Yes.
Volunteer with organizations, schools, companies, or, you know, that get you the best experience that you're going to be so appreciated. At the same time, you'll get to explore what the organization is about, explore what the leaders are like, and explore what the people that are working for the organization are like. And then you find your own way. You'll find your own.
Great, thank you. So there's another question from Mary Karen. What challenges or opportunities do you see in the future for women in leadership positions or future leaders in Chicago? So challenges, opportunities for women in leadership going into the future.
I'll kick us off. I think the opportunities are, we are in a moment right now where diversity, equity, and inclusion is literally the name of the game. Every company, corporation, organization is trying to figure out what they can do to be an ally, to better support, to better uplift, and provide access to women of color, people of color in general. And so I think if there were ever a time in our history, now is the time to speak up, to advocate for yourself, to have an agenda, know what you want, get yourself in the room, find a way to be a voice in those spaces. I've told several of my colleagues and friends this is a time for us to not be afraid and to really speak up. I think the challenge with that is there is a lot of radical change that has to happen. And not a lot of people, while they say they want change, they're not necessarily ready to do the work for things to change. And so I think while we're in this very unique moment, there's going to be a lot of resistance from going from just speaking about things to actualizing them. And so I think for us as leaders, for those of you who are entering leadership spaces, again, it's just time to be courageous. It's time to speak up, time to advocate, hold people accountable, and really know what you want to get out of it. And again, help to speak on behalf of those who don't have the access and privileges that we have.
I would add to that as there are more women in leadership, whether in corporate America or in not-for-profits or in government, I think this is a great time for us to talk more about pay equity. So at Mujeres Latinas en Acción, we're beginning our own examination of our own HR policies, practices, and procedures with regards to pay. And I think that the other thing that I would love to see more are changes with regards to how we support women and support employees and their families. Because we still do not have many of the benefits of paid leave, not only for paternity and maternity, but also when we have to take care of individuals in our family who are experiencing illness or getting old. And so I think that that's something that I would hope to see more, because we know that women carry that burden more than men. And we also know that women of color share a lot more responsibility, I think, because we have less access to services and resources to help us support our families. I think the other thing too, I think it's really important to do as well is women have a role in terms of shaking things up as the way of things have been. I think we're consensus builders, which is good. Not that we can't raise our voices, but that there's something to be said of the fact that I think women oftentimes want to work together. And I think that this is an opportunity for us as a society to examine how we make decisions, how we educate each other about opportunities and challenges that are happening. And so I hope that that is something that we see more and more in the workplace as women assume leadership roles.
And Linda, I'm so glad you mentioned the role of caregivers. And we women, immigrant women, are not only caregivers to our children, but to our older adults. And it's a constant load of work that we have to simultaneously deal with our professional life. We definitely need better support, better pay for people who are in the caregiving field of work, definitely. And then lastly, I just want to mention today's COVID world, actually, I believe, has brought women together closer through these virtual platforms and many opportunities that we wouldn't imagine in the past, right? In the past, we wouldn't imagine meeting Dr. Melissa, right, from California, unless, somebody makes that physical trip. So we should definitely utilize this new world, this new norm of virtual connection, networking, partnership support. So I am excited about that. I guess that's one good thing that came out from COVID, the flexibility. Yes. Mm-hmm.
So true. So true. We've got time for probably one more question. So let me raise something that we've talked about a little bit, alluded to a little bit, and it has to do with power. And, we've acknowledged to some degree some of the power that we on this panel have in terms of being educated. We have titles in our, respective organizations. People listen to what we have to say in a lot of ways, on a lot of different occasions. So talk about a moment that you used that power well, or moments that required some creative engagement or thought about how that power was used or distributed. So using it well, or needing to really think about challenges and how to better use that power. Any thoughts? A little bit on the spot right now. Nothing comes to mind?
Well, I think if you give power and you share power, there already has to be a basis of shared knowledge. And I think that's, we can't just give power and not share the knowledge of what we have as either leaders or that others have as peers in the work. And, I loved what Brittany said about subject matter experts. We all are subject matter experts, especially in the not-for-profit space. So, but we may not all know what we're all doing. So one of the things I think is really important that when we use power, whether it's leadership or we distribute power and we allow or we provide opportunities for people to make decisions about the way that an organization is moving forward, you have to make sure that the knowledge is there. And that takes work. And so if you're committed to giving power, you also have to be, and sharing power, you have to be committed to sharing that knowledge and that opportunities and making sure people are making decisions and using power based on being well-informed.
It's a really important point, because I think sometimes there's kind of empty gestures towards sharing power. If you're simply kind of distributing titles, but not helping to prepare people. And that makes me think of, sometimes talking about nonprofits and board governance, the notion of engaging community and having community representation on the governing board for nonprofit organizations. And sometimes those are essentially empty gestures, because it's just kind of picking people from community and just saying, here, sit on this board. But if folks are not prepared to do that, they're not helped to understand what are the responsibilities in those roles. They're not partnered with other folks on the board, so they're not just kind of left out there by themselves as the community representative, then it doesn't really work well. So, I mean, that's just something that came to mind about the real importance for making sure that people are prepared to take on some of those kind of power responsibilities. That's an obvious one, to sit on a board. That's not the only instance, but it is really important that the education, that the preparation goes along with that.
I want to add two things. One, I think it's important to note that sometimes people assume power has an absolute value, and it doesn't, and that power needs to be created. I think power exists, and I think we all have power. I think it's right. And we've touched on it in different ways. It's like recognizing our brilliance, recognizing our expertise, recognize that we have value. And I think it's also recognizing that we all have power. The question is do we see it in ourselves, and how do we use it? And I think the other piece too, and I feel like it links to the comment I just saw, as much as there's like to Pierre's comment about having a member of the community board join as an empty gesture. The question is, are we creating a space for them to be actually listened to, right? Again, as a scholar of nonprofits, I'm going to ask, actually, I'll tell you first, real quickly. So I was talking to someone who's working on a project to improve enrollment at a public school system in California. And I was like, well, have you asked the parents what they need? She's like, no. I was like, how are you designing a tool to improve enrollment if you're not actually talking to the parents? Because the parents should be the ones running the meeting. Right? Again, the women on this panel are not like, that's really stupid, right? But these academics who don't know where the power is, where the information is, where the knowledge is, because they think at their school that's the degree is not the degree in everything. It's who are we listening to, and whose power are we recognizing, and what are we actually trying to solve? Yeah.
That's important. And Jackie says also, if you're expecting accountability from a person in a situation, you also have to give them the authority and power to handle it. So that's a really great kind of tying up point for us to keep in mind. I think we've talked about a lot of issues, but authenticity, being open, bringing others along, realizing we're not in it by ourselves. We can ask questions, we can look to others for resources. I think those are all really, really important messages out of this conversation. We really would like to encourage everybody who has been with us today to practice what we've been talking about, to think about some of these questions, some of the points that have been made. If you're looking for mentors, think about some of the suggestions that have been put out there today. Look at the folks around you in different ways. Reach out. Don't just sit back and expect that things are just going to happen automatically. So again, thank you very much for joining us today. We have put a link in the chat with that goes to an evaluation. We would love to hear from you to get your feedback. We really thank each of our panelists. So Irene and Linda and Brittany and Melissa, thank you for joining us and for opening yourselves up and having this conversation today. And thank you all who have joined us in asking questions and sharing your feedback and resources. That's what we want to be doing here today. So we look forward to seeing you in the future. So just have to put in a plug for the Axelson Center again. Look at our website to see what we'll be having coming up next. And we will be letting you know about what's coming up next year. Soon, we're working on it. It's not there yet. So thank you all again. And Brittany's got something about her 5-year anniversary celebration. Remember, she started her own organization. So that also is something to help her to celebrate. And she's got the link for the tickets. So we will be looking at that as well. So thank you all. Take care. Bye-bye.